When Mosey hit the mesh at 6:47 a.m., the sound crossed the service corridor like a struck rail, sharp enough that Doug Robinson felt it in his teeth before he fully processed what his eyes were seeing, and by the time the second impact rattled bolts along panel C4, 3 handlers behind him had already stepped backward in the mist with their palms up, not from panic, but from drilled instinct, while the 463-pound Silverback rose to full height, shoulders wide, canines bared for a beat that looked catastrophic on the overhead monitor. Then, just as quickly, Mosey folded forward over his own chest, forearms crossing tight against his body, massive head angled down as if shielding his clavicle, and the movement was so abrupt, so contradictory, that everyone watching froze in the same confused posture. It looked like pre-charge compression on camera. Up close to Doug, it looked like pain. "Hold the line," Doug said quietly, eyes never leaving Mosey. Nia Alvarez, junior keeper, held the incident tablet with both hands because her fingers were shaking against the cold aluminum frame. "Logging impact behavior, 2 strikes, 1 rise, 1 fold," she muttered, voice too fast. Timestamp 6:47:18. Mosey stayed hunched, breathing high and shallow, then lifted his gaze through wet mesh and fixed on Doug with an intensity that always unsettled new staff, and never unsettled Doug in the same way. There was alarm in it. Yes, but there was also orientation, the unmistakable check-in he had seen dozens of times when a dropped bucket clanged or a delivery truck backfired at the loading bay. Rain ticked on steel grating overhead. A vent kicked on and hummed. Somewhere behind the row of night houses, a gate chain clattered, and Mosey flinched hard at that small metal sound as if the air itself had snapped at him. No one spoke for 6 full seconds. On the camera feed in Control 2, the sequence would be clipped to 9 seconds and flagged as escalating unpredictability. In the corridor, inside the wet smell of straw, disinfectant and gorilla musk, those 9 seconds felt like a question nobody had time to answer correctly. Was this a threat display about to turn into contact aggression, or a defensive pattern from an old wound that the system kept misreading? Doug felt his heart sink, because he knew which interpretation was already winning in the board packet. He was 44 years old, senior gorilla keeper, 17 years in primate care across 2 sanctuaries and 1 rehabilitation unit, and he had spent the last 4 of those years building routine with Mosey 1 measured hour at a time. Approach from the left at an oblique angle, no loose metal on belt clips, no abrupt hand lift above shoulder line, pause 3 breaths before verbal cue. The details looked fussy in policy notes. They were survival details for trust. "Doug," Mateo Briggs, shift lead, said from behind him, voice controlled. "Director's office asked whether we classify this as active threat." Doug swallowed, keeping his posture low and open. "Classify it as unresolved," he said. "Don't simplify this." Mateo exhaled through his nose, already knowing that wasn't a category anyone above them liked. Mosey uncurled by degrees, not with the explosive release of a challenge display, but with visible caution, one hand still touching his upper right chest, near the pale cable scar beneath the clavicle, the one old injury every new veterinarian noted in orientation, and almost no incident summary mentioned again after week 3. Doug took 1 half step back from the mesh, mirrored the Silverback's lowered shoulders, and softened his own jaw, a practiced signal that had reduced pacing episodes in spring. Mosey watched, blinked once, then dropped to knuckle stance and turned toward the interior mound as if exhausted by the sequence he had initiated. Nia looked from the animal to Doug. "That looked bad on camera," she said breathlessly. "It always does," Doug said. The corridor lights flickered once as the rain intensified, and for a moment, the sanctuary felt suspended between 2 versions of truth, the one the lens amplified, and the one a body in the room could read. When they labeled Mosey unpredictable and approved emergency transfer, what one child saw through the glass changed everything. In the channel's rough cut, the voiceover had dropped in with its usual prompt, urging viewers to like and subscribe so they would not miss another touching story like this one, then asking them to write in the comments where they were watching from and what time it was there. By 5:58 a.m., 49 minutes before the mesh impact, Doug had already felt the day tightening around him. He stood under the awning outside Night House 3 with a paper cup gone cold in his hand and reviewed the overnight behavioral log on Nia's tablet, while dawn light spread grey over the North Ridge Primate Sanctuary outside Eugene, Oregon. Mosey, Western Lowland male, age 19, intake weight at confiscation 121.6 kilograms, current weight 210 kilograms, had refused half of his leaf mix and all citrus supplement during the 4:30 a.m. prep window. Cortisol labs had been elevated for 11 consecutive days. Net intake decline tracked at 2.8 kilograms over that span. 4 posture events in 7 days, all during high-noise windows. 1 cracked enrichment barrel from a startle response 2 evenings earlier. No direct contact incidents. No injuries to staff, no aggression toward troop-adjacent females through parallel mesh. The data did not read like random volatility. It read like a pattern asking to be decoded before policy crushed it flat. "Board call is at noon," Matteo said, joining him under the awning. Rain misted the edge of his jacket. "Protocol Red 12 review stays on agenda unless Dr. Reyes pulls it." Doug rubbed his thumb over the cup seam. "She won't pull it without stronger evidence." "Then we need stronger evidence before lunch." They walked the service path together, boots clicking hollow on wet steel grates as generators kicked on in staggered sequence. Across the habitat line, the public observation deck was empty except for folded stanchions and a volunteer ranger setting out caution cones where water pooled near the glass. The sanctuary looked peaceful to outsiders at this hour. Cedar trees, low fog, birds cutting across the perimeter netting. Inside operations, everything moved by timed routines and risk matrices. That morning, every routine felt like a countdown. At 6:14 a.m., Nia met them in Control 2 with printouts she had highlighted in yellow so aggressively the pages looked bruised. "I pulled all event footage from the last 2 weeks," she said, pushing her glasses up with her wrist, because both hands were full. Posture events correlate with metallic transients above 82 decibels, not visitor volume in general, specific frequencies. Doug stared at her, then at the graph. "You ran frequency overlays?" "After shift yesterday, I thought maybe I was seeing ghosts in the data." Matteo gave a short, dry laugh that broke almost immediately. "If those are ghosts, they're organized." Doug felt a pulse of fragile hope, quickly followed by dread. He could already hear the board response. Interesting, preliminary, not actionable under current threat designation. Protocol. Red 12 existed for worst-case scenarios, for the rare but devastating moment when a primate's behavior crossed into high-probability harm. Its logic was blunt by design. Remove first, interpret later. In many cases, that bluntness saved lives. In this case, Doug feared it would shatter one. He signed the 6:20 pre-shift checklist, initialed feed transfer, and paused over the red banner attached to Mosey's file. Temporary, elevated risk status. The banner had first appeared 11 days earlier, after a visitor dropped a metal thermos near the glass, and Mosey slammed the barrier once, then folded over himself in the same compressed shape, now appearing in clip after clip. 3 words had entered the board summary after that incident: unstable, escalating, unsafe. 37 pages of nuanced keeper notes were collapsed beneath those 3 words like wet cardboard. At 6:31 a.m., Dr. Imani Reyes called from the veterinary wing, voice calm, clipped by corridor echo. "I saw the overnight chart. Any feed acceptance?" "Partial only," Doug answered. "Leaf mixed down by half. No citrus. We repeat thermal scan at 10. If there's another event, no one attempts proximity beyond established line." He looked through the control room glass toward Mosey's holding area, where the Silverback sat with one arm draped over his knee, gaze fixed on nothing visible. "I understand." Imani lowered her voice. "I know what you think this is, Doug. Bring me evidence I can defend." After the call ended, he stood with the tablet against his chest and listened to rain tap the skylight in uneven bursts, like fingers on metal rails. He had spent 4 years learning the rhythm of one animal's alarms, yet he was running out of hours to translate that knowledge into a language administrators would accept. By policy clock, he had 18 hours before transfer activation if the threat designation held through evening review. 18 hours before Mosey could be moved off-site to a concrete quarantine pen with no troop adjacency, no familiar terrain, no keeper he oriented to, no chance to test whether the so-called unpredictability was fear wrapped around pain memory. At 6:46, as they took positions along the service corridor for routine visual check, Doug noticed one detail that tightened every muscle in his back. Mosey's right hand hovered over the old clavicle scar even at rest, not pressing yet, just hovering, as if bracing for impact that had not come. He opened his mouth to flag it for the tablet. Then the chain at the exterior gate snapped against steel in the wind, and the enclosure exploded into motion. Mosey drove forward with a burst of force that made the mesh boom like a drumhead, then bounced back to full height, arms wide, throat rumbling in a low staccato that rolled through the corridor floor. Doug felt Matteo move at his shoulder, felt Nia suck in air behind them, and still kept his palms open at waist level, knees bent, posture small. The Silverback's eyes were bright and hard for one beat. Then the whole frame of him collapsed inward. Forearms crossed over his chest, chin tucked, right hand pressing high under the clavicle scar. "Do not crowd him," Doug said, voice steady enough to surprise himself. "Nia, mark hand-to-scar contact." "Marked," she whispered, tapping too hard on the screen. 064722. Mosey rocked once in that folded shape, exhaled through pursed lips, and gave a short cough that sounded dry and irritated, not respiratory deep. Doug catalogued details the way he had trained himself to do when panic wanted to flatten everything into danger. No piloerection along the spine, no direct charge line toward a person, no repeated threat bark, no pursuit behavior. High arousal, yes. Startle cascade, yes. Protective compression, yes. He turned his head slightly toward Matteo without breaking visual contact. "Gate source?" "Exterior chain strike," Matteo said. "Wind load. Maintenance already pinged." "Ping them again. Secure it now." Matteo spoke into his shoulder radio, clipped and efficient, while Mosey stayed hunched and breathing fast enough that Doug could see the movement under thick chest fur. At 10 meters, the sound was still audible. A quick inhale-exhale cycle that did not settle after 30 seconds the way normal startle events did. Doug felt concern take on a sharper edge. This was not only behavior. Something hurt. "Respiratory count," he said. Nia lifted her chin from the tablet and watched for 15 seconds with lips moving silently. 9 in 15. 36 per minute, Doug said. "Too high at rest. Log it." Mosey shifted his weight to the left knuckles and kept his right hand near the scar, fingers flexing. He did not take the offered browse branch lying a meter from his feet. He did not orient to the troop-adjacent vocalization coming from the female habitat on the other side of the service wall. He stared at Doug with that same check-in gaze, then pressed his forearm tighter across his own chest. Doug lowered his shoulders and mirrored the fold, not as deeply, careful to keep his profile oblique. It was a method he had discovered by accident during a thunderstorm in March, when Mosey had compressed in the corner and refused all cues until Doug copied his posture and slowed his own breathing. 2 cycles now, 3, 4. Mosey blinked and dropped his head a fraction, jaw loosening. The rumble in his throat faded to silence. Nia's voice came thin with relief. "He's down 2 breaths." "Keep counting," Doug said. The chains snapped again somewhere beyond the loading lane, a smaller metallic slap this time, and Mosey flinched so violently his left foot skidded on wet concrete. He did not charge. He folded tighter, almost curling around the old injury, and gave one short, distressed grunt that made Doug's stomach turn. "Maintenance status?" Doug asked. Matteo pressed the radio earpiece. 2 minutes out to Gate E. "Make it 1." By 6:55 a.m., rain had thickened into steady sheets that hissed off roof edges and turned the walkway drains into narrow silver streams. Mosey had moved to the interior mound but remained compressed, back-rounded, refusing his citrus and leaf tray even when the food was slid in with minimal noise. Doug stood in control too, with droplets still on his jacket, and replayed the camera sequence frame by frame, while Nia exported timestamps to the incident folder. On screen, the motion looked like classic pre-assault loading. Strike, rise, contract. In person, the contraction had lasted too long and centered too precisely over the right clavicle. "Doctor," Imani Reyes answered on first ring. "I saw the alert." 2 mesh strikes, 1 rise, sustained protective fold, repeated scar guarding, respiratory 36 after stimulus, Doug said. No target pursuit, no directed aggression. "Any wheeze, sputum, cyanosis?" "None. Dry cough once." Imani paused and he could hear a door close at her end. "I'm coming over with thermal and portable ultrasound. No sedation unless he decompensates." "Understood." "And Doug," she said, voice quieter. "If he repeats panel impact at that force, admin will push Red 12 activation before noon." "I know." He ended the call and kept watching the clip, zooming into Mosey's right shoulder as the body folded. There was a tiny hitch just before compression, like a wince made huge by mass. He clipped that frame and tagged it, "Scar flare possible." Nia looked over his shoulder. "Could be just muscle tension," she said, trying to sound neutral. "Could be," Doug replied. "Could also be chronic pain plus startle pattern." She swallowed. "Do we have enough to argue?" "Not yet." At 7:03, Maintenance Supervisor Glenn Hooper radioed from Gate E. "Corroded shackle, wind-driven oscillation, chain striking post every 20 to 30 seconds. Temporary wrap installed. Replacement hardware inbound from storage." Matteo requested written confirmation and decibel readings from Glenn's handheld meter. Glenn gave them peaks at 84 to 88 decibels at corridor line during gusts. Nia entered each value into the log, and Doug felt a narrow line of validation cut through dread. They had a trigger source. They still did not have protection from policy interpretation. Imani arrived at 7:11 in a blue rain shell, portable scanner case in one hand, and thermal unit in the other. She was 49, head veterinarian, 18 years in great ape medicine, and she moved with the calm economy that kept teams functional when everyone else was running on adrenaline. She looked through the control glass for less than 5 seconds before asking, "Current state?" "Folded posture intermittent, scar guarding persistent, feed refusal ongoing," Doug said. "No directed threat behavior since first event." Imani watched Mosey angle himself away from a dripping gutter pipe that tapped faintly against metal. "Let's get temperatures from standoff. Keep corridor quiet." The thermal scan took 90 seconds. Mosey tolerated it as long as Doug remained visible at the left frame edge, hands down, breathing slow. The display painted hot bands in oranges and yellows across chest and shoulders, with one brighter patch near the right clavicle that pulsed when Mosi shifted. Imani narrowed her eyes. Localized heat elevation over old scar tract could be inflammation, could be referred strain from repeated compression. Can scar tissue flare this fast? Nia asked softly. It can when startle cycles stack, Imani said. Pain makes startle worse. Startle makes guarding worse. Loop builds on itself. Doug leaned closer to the glass, tracking Mosey's face. The silverback was no longer glaring. He looked tired, almost embarrassed by his own arousal, and that familiar tenderness hit Doug with painful force, because fear was often read as intent when housed in a body that large. Imani set the ultrasound case down, but did not open it. Portable imaging from here won't be clean through mesh and movement. I can attempt if he settles at panel line. He settles with mirrored posture, Doug said. She gave him a quick look. Then show me. He stepped to the marked line in the service corridor, 5 meters from panel C4, and waited until Mosey noticed him. No voice cue at first, just presence. Then Doug softened his knees and folded his own forearms across his chest in a slow, deliberate arc, not full closure, enough to signal shape. Mosey stared for 3 seconds, nostrils flaring. Doug exhaled on a 4 count and repeated. Mosey's shoulders dropped 1 notch. He lowered onto knuckles and took 2 measured steps toward the panel, stopping short of contact. Now, Imani murmured, raising the probe. The scan captured only partial images, grainy and shallow, but enough to show thickened tissue around the scar line and a small fluid pocket that had not appeared on spring imaging. Imani saved the stills, jaw tight. Not diagnostic yet, she said, but this is not nothing. Can you put that in writing for the noon review? Doug asked. I can put suspected pain-associated guarding behavior with startle-linked escalation. She slid the probe away as Mosey backed off and folded again, though less tightly than before. Admin will ask whether pain excludes risk. It doesn't. It reframes risk. At 7:28, Glenn called back with confirmation that the chain assembly had been fully replaced and padded. Noise at corridor dropped to baseline. For 12 minutes afterward, Mosey remained near the interior mound with no fresh mesh strikes. He still refused citrus, picked once at soaked kale, and touched the scar every few breaths. Nia set a fresh tray with soft yams and warm mash to reduce chewing effort. Mosey sniffed, took 1 bite, and set the food down untouched. Doug noted each action with timestamp precision because concern without data got dismissed as attachment. He entered. 7:33, no impact behavior. 7:35 accepted 1 bite soft mash. 7:36, hand to scar contact times 3. 7:39, mirrored settle response observed. Then he opened the board packet draft and saw the pre-filled line for recommendation unchanged. Transfer prep authorization, pending final incident review. Matteo read over his shoulder and muttered, "They populated that before morning rounds." Doug closed his eyes for 1 breath, 2. Then we overwrite it with evidence. The sanctuary director, Ellen Shaw, called at 7:44 from administration. Her tone was professional, not cruel, and that made the pressure harder to fight. Doug, I have safety committee members asking if this morning qualifies as escalation under Red 12. It qualifies as unresolved medical behavior interaction, he said, not random aggression. Can you substantiate that by noon? He looked through glass at Mosey, who was sitting now with his back against the slope, right hand resting lightly over the scar as rain drummed the roof in patient, relentless rhythm. I can substantiate trigger linkage, pain indicators, and de-escalation response under controlled posture mirroring. A pause, paper shifting on her end. Submit everything in writing by 11:30. Include raw logs, not just interpretation. I will. After the call, he forwarded maintenance decibel reports, thermal snapshots, ultrasound stills, and Nia's frequency overlay to the incident repository. Then printed hard copies because board members trusted paper they could hold more than screens they could question. Nia brought him a stapler and a fresh pen without speaking. He saw how pale she was and touched her elbow lightly. "You did good work this morning," he said. She gave a tight nod. "I keep replaying the first slam." "So do I," he answered. By 8:06 a.m., visitor gates were still closed due to weather, and the sanctuary sounded like machines and rain. Vent fans, drainage pumps, distant cartwheels muffled on wet concrete. In that muted window, Mosey's breathing finally dropped below 24 per minute. He accepted 3 spoonfuls of warm mash through the feed slot. He did not approach the mesh. He did not display. Doug let himself feel 1 inch of hope, and then forced his attention back to observation, because concern remained the only honest emotion in the room. Relief was premature, fear was unhelpful, and denial had already cost them 11 days. Imani stood beside him with the tablet and dictated findings for the clinical note. Episode appears stimulus-linked, not spontaneous. Guarding behavior localized to chronic scar region. Recommend immediate acoustic mitigation and trauma-informed handling adjustments, pending formal review. Doug turned to her. "Will you testify that transfer could worsen condition?" She met his gaze. "I'll testify that forced relocation under active startle pain loop carries high welfare risk and uncertain safety benefit." It was the strongest sentence he could have asked for before noon. At 8:19, Mosey moved toward panel C4 again. Doug felt every muscle in his back brace for impact, but the Silverback stopped short, looked through the mesh, and slowly folded his arms over his chest without striking, almost as if demonstrating the posture in quiet. He held it there, breathing controlled, then opened his hands and placed one palm flat against the wire. Not a threat, not surrender. A signal Doug still could not fully translate, except to know it mattered. Nia's voice trembled. "Do I log that as event?" Doug watched Mosey keep his palm on the mesh, gaze lowered. "Yes," he said softly. "Log it as posture event without impact. And add this line exactly. Behavior occurred in silence, with no external trigger detected, and resolved with open hand contact." He did not look away until Mosey dropped his arm and turned back toward the mound, carrying his weight carefully, like an animal trying to protect a place that kept hurting every time the world got loud. Doug stayed at the corridor line until Mosey disappeared behind the interior mound, then lowered his own arms slowly, as if dropping them too quickly might startle the air itself back into motion. Rain thudded on the corrugated roof, softer now, and the sanctuary's generator hum settled into a steady mechanical bass that made every breath feel counted. He looked down at the tablet in his hands and replayed the last 20 seconds once more. No mesh strike, no lunge, no canines, only the fold, the open hand, the pause. Evidence could feel cold and technical on paper, but he had learned over 17 years that this kind of sequence held biography inside it, and he was watching a biography no one in administration had stood close enough to read. Nia shifted beside him and spoke without taking her eyes off the glass. When he does that fold, it looks like he's trying to make himself smaller than he is. Doug nodded. That's exactly what it is in mammals under threat. Compression reduces exposure, protects vulnerable points. He tapped the spot beneath his own right clavicle. And for him, this point has a history. Imani closed the thermal file and leaned against the console. Pull his original intake packet again, she said quietly. Not the summary, the field photos. Naya brought it up, and the old images opened in a dim sequence on screen. Infant Mosi under harsh flash, wire flooring, an enclosure barely larger than a supply closet, right shoulder abraded, clavicle region swollen, eyes too bright. Doug had seen those photos dozens of times, and still felt his throat tighten every time. The timestamp in the metadata read 18 years, 4 months, 3 days ago. Confiscation site, private roadside exhibit off Highway 22. Reporting note, repetitive startle response to metallic impact. Field sedation delayed due to panic thrashing. He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed once, because the adult silverback in front of them and the infant in those photos were one continuous nervous system trying to stay alive in a world that had not been gentle. He was 8 months when they took him, Doug said. Weight was 19 kilos. He learned early that loud metal meant restraint. Imani's voice stayed even. And we are still making metal sounds around him. The sentence was not accusation. It was math. By 8:37 a.m., after the maintenance team finished padding 2 secondary gates and replacing a loose latch pin on the service cart route, the corridor noise profile dropped another measured 6 decibels, and Mosi took 4 more spoonfuls of warm mash from the feed slot, each accepted with long pauses in between. Doug logged every spoonful. He logged every hand movement to the scar. He logged one brief eye orient to troop-adjacent vocalizations from female habitat B. Then he asked Nia to pull the long-range behavior chart from spring to now, because empathy alone would not keep a gorilla out of quarantine. Empathy had to be translated into trend lines, trigger maps, and defensible language. The chart painted a pattern no one could call random. Event clusters followed acoustic spikes. Days with soft maintenance windows showed lower respiratory arousal. Mirrored posture interventions reduced episode duration by an average of 38%. Days after visitor stanchions were moved farther from glass had fewer barrier strikes. Mosi was not a mystery animal in constant volatility. He was legible, and legibility had been flattened by fear. Doug printed the graph stack and set it beside the old intake photos. "This is his story," he said, "not the 3-word label." Nia gave a thin, tired smile. Unstable, escalating, unsafe. "Those words describe a situation," he said, "not a soul." At 8:52, he stepped into the side prep room where the smell of soaked hay mixed with iodine and wet rubber boots. He stripped off his damp gloves, sat on an overturned feed bin, and opened the handwritten notebook he still kept despite the digital system. The one he never showed administration because it contained observation language too human for policy templates. Page after page held quiet details. Prefers left side approach, startles at dangling keys, settles to 4-count exhale, avoids overhead shadows at noon. Right shoulder tenderness increases after storms. Tolerates staff conversation if tone remains low. He had written those notes across 4 years because Mosi's trust had never been general, only specific, and specific trust was a fragile infrastructure built by repetition. He heard footsteps and looked up as Matteo came in with 2 fresh clipboards and rain on his jacket shoulders. "Safety Committee advanced the review," Matteo said. "Not noon, 11:15. Doug stared for half a second. "Why?" "Storm staffing adjustments. Director wants decisions before visitor volume picks up." Matteo handed over a printed agenda. "You, Dr. Reyes, and me in person. 2 board members remote." Doug scanned the sheet. Item 3. Red 12 transfer authorization. Item 4. Risk mitigation alternatives if transfer deferred. He felt the old fatigue of institutional meetings settle behind his eyes. that specific exhaustion of trying to explain living behavior inside bureaucratic boxes that demanded binary outcomes. He tucked the notebook away and stood. "Then we go in with full context," he said. Matteo watched him for a beat. "You care about him like family," Doug answered without hesitation. "I care about getting this right." The corridor camera beeped as motion tagged Mosey crossing into panel view again. Not fast, not agitated, just present. Doug returned to the glass and found the Silverback seated on a folded straw, chin lowered, right hand resting over the scar, left hand open on the concrete. Mosey looked up and held Doug's gaze in silence, then mirrored a smaller version of the chest fold and released it. A practice motion, a rehearsal of safety. Doug copied it once, and Mosey's breathing slowed by 2 counts per minute. No one in that room called it sentimentality. They called it data with a pulse. At 9:18 a.m., the public side remained closed, but the weather lightened enough that skylight glare brightened the observation hall, and the sanctuary's normal daytime rhythm started to wake. Radios checking in, carts rolling, doors opening in measured cycles. With each sound, Doug felt the clock becoming visible. They had entered the phase where deterioration could return quickly if one trigger slipped through. He opened the countdown note on his tablet and updated it for accuracy. 14 hours, 42 minutes until transfer window could be activated if Red 12 held. Dread did not arrive as panic. It arrived as arithmetic. The first arithmetic problem was intake. Mosey had consumed only a fraction of morning calories. At current rate, he would remain in deficit by evening, and caloric deficit worsened stress tolerance. The second problem was policy threshold. One additional high-force impact during active review could shift undecided committee members toward transfer regardless of medical context. The third problem was setting. Storm days echoed. Even with gate padding, the steel walkways, drain grates, and service doors created sudden transients that no one could eliminate entirely. "Visitor forecast?" Doug asked without turning. Nia checked the operations channel. "Reduced but not empty. School group cancelled. Donators still coming in low numbers after 11:30 if weather holds." He looked at the mesh, then at the sound meter taped near panel C4. "Keep hallway cap at 45 decibels. No carts on this lane unless rubber wheels." "Already put in request," she said. "Security says they can enforce until noon, review only." "Only?" "Afternoon it reverts unless director signs extension." He felt his jaw tighten. So the period when he needs stability most is when we lose controls. Imani, standing at the counter with ultrasound stills spread in front of her, answered without looking up. "That's what your meeting is for." At 9:41, a metal latch 2 corridors over dropped unexpectedly. The sound was not loud by human standards, but Mosey jolted upright so fast his shoulder clipped the mesh. One hit, not full force but hard enough to ring. Doug stepped to the line, palms open, and lowered his frame. "Easy, Mosey, easy," he breathed. Mosey huffed, folded over the scar, then pressed his forehead lightly to his own forearm, eyes squeezed shut. Doug copied the fold and counted out loud in a near whisper. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the second cycle, Mosey's breath began to lengthen. On the fourth, he dropped back to knuckles. Nia logged with clipped precision. 9:41:12 latch noise trigger. 9:41:14 single panel contact. 9:41:18 protective fold. 9:41:31 mirrored de-escalation onset. Doug did not move until Mosey moved. When the Silverback settled, he returned to Control 2 and entered a note he knew board members would scrutinize. Impact event occurred without target pursuit, followed immediately by self-guarding and conditioned calming response. The math kept moving anyway. By 10:06 a.m., with review now 70 minutes away, Doug and Imani assembled the evidence packet on the stainless prep table in strict order. Incident timeline, decibel logs from Gate E, thermal maps showing localized heat near scar, ultrasound stills indicating soft tissue thickening, feeding chart, respiration chart, correlation graph between metallic transients and posture events, de-escalation response documentation, historical intake records from confiscation case. Each page represented effort, but what haunted him was how thin even a thick packet looked against the blunt authority of one emergency protocol. Matteo entered with his radio in hand and said, "Director wants a one-page executive summary." Imani looked up sharply. A one-page summary of a trauma-linked pain profile? Her words, Matteo said, not defensive, just tired. Committee needs concise decision support. Doug let out a breath that felt scraped on the way out. Concise is how we got here. He wrote it anyway because refusal would be interpreted as non-compliance. He stripped away nuance line by line until the page read like a courtroom filing. Observed behavior pattern was stimulus-linked. Injury site involvement likely. Transfer risk included increased arousal due to environmental disruption. Recommended immediate trauma-informed accommodations and medical follow-up. He signed at the bottom with a pen that left a slight blot on the final letter of his last name. At 10:22, Ellen Shaw arrived in person, umbrella still dripping, hair damp at the temples. She greeted the room with brisk professionalism and took the packet in both hands, flipping first to the summary page exactly as Doug expected. "This is thorough," she said. "But I need to ask directly. Can anyone in this room guarantee no further panel impact today?" No one answered for a second. Imani spoke first. "No one can guarantee that in any aroused great ape under environmental stress." Ellen nodded once. "Then Safety Committee will focus on probability reduction." Doug held her gaze. "Probability reduction is what we are proposing. Transfer may reduce staff anxiety, but it is not guaranteed risk reduction for him or us if the underlying trigger follows him." Ellen's expression softened by a fraction, then closed again into administrative neutrality. "Make that argument at 11:15. When she left, the room felt smaller. At 10:47, just as they prepared to walk to the review room, Security Supervisor Harris Cole radioed in with a procedural reminder that landed like a door shutting. Under active Red 12 consideration, no additional proximity experiments authorized beyond existing keeper line. No adaptive behavior demonstrations with public present. Confirm receipt. Doug pressed transmit. Control 2 confirms. He clipped the radio back to his belt, harder than necessary. "So we can't run the one test that would actually settle interpretation." Imani gathered her papers. "Not before committee vote. Committee vote is based on incomplete interpretation." "That's institutional risk management," she said, and for the first time that morning, anger edged her calm. "I didn't design it." He knew she was on his side. The anger still needed somewhere to go, and there was nowhere ethical to put it. By 11:13 a.m., they were seated at the long conference table overlooking the rain-dark Cedar Line, the same room where budget discussions happened and where life-altering decisions could be made in under 20 minutes. On the wall monitor, 2 board members appeared in small remote windows from dry offices miles away. Doug placed the packet in front of each seat and kept his palms flat to stop them from shaking. The chair called the meeting to order and began with protocol language. Incident count, staff safety obligation, public exposure concerns. Then Doug was given 6 minutes. He stood and spoke plainly. "Mosey's behavior is being classified as unpredictable aggression. Our data shows a different pattern. Specific acoustic triggers, repeat protective posture focused on chronic scar region, and consistent de-escalation with controlled handling cues. He has no directed pursuit incidents. He has no contact injuries to staff. He has a documented trauma history involving metallic restraint. Transfer under Red 12 removes familiar stabilizers and may increase arousal while failing to treat pain. A board member on the monitor leaned toward her camera. Keeper Robinson, are you asking us to ignore 2 mesh strikes at 6:47? I'm asking you to interpret them accurately. Another member tapped the summary page. How do we explain visible force to staff who feel unsafe? Matteo answered before Doug could. By training to read behavior sequences, not single frames. Discussion turned clinical, then procedural, then circular. One member accepted the trigger data but questioned sample size. Another accepted possible pain but argued that pain could still produce dangerous outcomes. Ellen asked about immediate mitigations if transfer paused. Imani listed them: acoustic dampening, revised route controls, anti-clatter hardware, adjusted visitor windows, targeted analgesic trial with monitoring, adaptive behavior, consult within 48 hours. Doug watched faces as she spoke and saw what he dreaded most. Not hostility, but uncertainty hardening into caution. At 11:39, the chair requested a closed 10-minute deliberation with operational staff outside the room. In the hallway, Doug stood under a vent that clicked every 12 seconds and stared at the floor tiles until they blurred. Nia waited with her tablet hugged to her chest. "Any read?" she asked softly. "Not yet." Harris from security passed by and paused. "For what it's worth, my team saw the morning clips. Some of us agree with you." He hesitated. "But policy is policy until it changes." Doug gave a tight nod. "That's the problem." When they were called back in, the chair read the interim decision in a measured voice. Red 12 transfer authorization remained active, but delayed pending one final afternoon review, contingent on 0 severe incidents and submission of additional, corroborating evidence from controlled observation. No public interaction testing authorized. No deviation from barrier protocols. Final decision scheduled for 6 p.m. The numbers hit Doug before the words finished. They had bought time, but only a fragment of it. He signed the acknowledgement form because he had to. He collected the packet because no one else would carry it carefully. He stepped back into the corridor where rain had finally thinned to mist, and through the glass he saw Mosey sitting in profile, broad back, rising and falling, one hand resting over the old scar as if holding the memory of pain in place so it would not spill out all at once. Doug set his palm against the cool observation glass from his side and whispered, too low for anyone but himself to hear, "I'm still here," then straightened, opened the operations channel, and asked for every available sound reading before the afternoon window began. Nia answered him on channel 2 almost at once, her breath audible between words as she moved down the service lane with the handheld meter. Panel C4 baseline is 41 decibels, corridor vent peak 46, drain pulse 38, gate E now 35 with no chain slap. Doug listened, repeated each number back for confirmation, and entered them into the supplemental reports the committee had demanded. His hands were steady now, but only because he forced each motion into procedure. Confirm reading, log timestamp, attach source file, upload raw data, print hard copy, sign initials in blue ink. At 11:47 a.m., Dr. Imani Reyes stepped beside him with a capped syringe in a padded case and a revised clinical form. "I'm authorizing a low-dose analgesic trial," she said quietly. "Oral route through MASH. No sedation. We monitor respiratory rate, guarding frequency, and panel orientation every 5 minutes for 90. She tapped the form. If there's improvement, it supports pain involvement. If there's no change, we still learn. Doug signed as witness, and for the first time since dawn, hope arrived as something measurable rather than imagined. He carried the prepared mash to the feed slot himself, announcing his presence with the same 2 soft knuckle taps he had used for years. Mosey emerged from behind the mound slowly, a dark, massive silhouette against wet concrete and pale straw, right arm held close for 2 steps until he saw Doug's lowered posture. The silverback paused, nostrils flaring, then accepted the bowl without grabbing. Doug watched him taste once, wait, taste again, and settle onto folded straw to eat in small, deliberate mouthfuls, not hungry enough to finish, but willing. It felt like a door opening 1 inch. By 12:03 p.m., the rain had thinned to a silver mist that clung to the cedar line and softened the roof noise enough that each interior sound stood out sharply. A latch click in Prep B, wheels on rubber matting, Nia's pen scratching paper. Mosey consumed 40% of the medicated portion, then lifted his right hand to the scar and held it there for 6 breaths before lowering it. Doug logged hand-to-scar contact at reduced duration and looked up at the monitor where respiratory count hovered at 22 per minute, down from the morning spike. Imani saw it too and said nothing for a moment, as if silence could keep the data from slipping away. Mateo entered with 2 laminated signs and a roll of removable tape. Quiet window in effect. Access route only. Director approved corridor controls through final review, he said, voice flat with fatigue but edged by relief. Security complained. She overruled them. Doug took one of the signs, pressed tape to the acrylic beside the public hall entrance, and felt that same fragile hope strengthen. It was still temporary. It was still conditional. But someone in authority had chosen adaptation over automatic force for 1 more block of hours. At 12:19, Ellen Shaw called from administration, this time with less distance in her tone. I read the full packet again, she said. I'm not promising outcome, but I authorized acoustic contractor consult for tomorrow morning if transfer is deferred. Doug stared through the glass at Mosey, who had shifted to left side rest with his right shoulder supported by straw. Thank you, he said. Ellen exhaled softly. Bring me corroboration this afternoon that any board member can understand in 30 seconds. The line clicked off, leaving him with both opportunity and pressure, braided so tightly they were almost the same feeling. Nia arrived with visitor schedule printouts at 12:27 p.m., pages dotted with cancellations from storm alerts and highlighted notes from accessibility services. We're low volume after 1:30, she said, tracing the list with her finger. 4 donors, 2 staff family entries, 1 pediatric rehab visit marked recurring. Lena Park, 11, wheelchair user, accompanied by Hannah Park and therapist Gillian Sato. They requested quiet lane because of sensory rehab protocol. Doug looked at the name, then at the silent corridor. Keep them in observation hall too if they come. No crowding the glass, no sudden movement. Imani glanced up from her charting. We are not staging a demonstration. We aren't, Doug said. We're protecting a low-noise window and observing what he chooses. At 12:41, Mosey stood and crossed toward panel C4 without speed, stopping short of the mesh with shoulders half raised. Doug felt his own spine tighten, then watched the silverback fold forward in that now familiar compression, arms crossing over chest, chin tucked. No strike came, no bark. After 4 seconds, Mosey opened his hands and let them hang loose at his sides, then sat back down. Nia looked from the live view to Doug. Posture event without impact, resolved in 6 seconds, she said, almost disbelieving. He nodded. Mark environmental condition. Quiet window active. No metallic transient detected. She logged it exactly. 3 days of constant alarms had taught everyone to fear any movement towards the panel. Seeing an event resolve without force changed the room's breathing. Matteo unclenched his jaw. Nia stopped biting the inside of her cheek. Even Harris from security, standing watch near the secondary door, murmured, "That's the first clean one I've seen." Doug did not celebrate. He had learned too well that fragile improvements could reverse with one dropped tool or one slammed gate. Still, the pattern was widening, and widening patterns could become evidence that survived committee scrutiny. At 1:02 p.m., Glenn Hooper returned with finished work orders and photos of every padded hinge, replaced latch, and damped chain on the east lane. Doug reviewed each image, signed receipt, and uploaded the packet to the board repository under Mitigation Actions Completed. Physical evidence submitted. Time-stamped. Undeniable. Glenn lingered at the doorway. "For what it's worth," he said, rubbing rainwater from his moustache, "we never should have left that chain assembly that long. That one's on maintenance." Doug met his eyes and nodded once. "Noted in the record." Glenn gave a grateful, embarrassed shrug and left. By 1:18, the analgesic trial reached 90 minutes. Imani ran a standoff reassessment and read the numbers out loud while Nia transcribed. Respiratory baseline 19 to 21. Guarding episodes reduced frequency. Feed acceptance improved to 53% with soft yam offered at 110. No high-force barrier contact since 9:41. She signed the clinical addendum and handed it to Doug. "This is corroboration," she said. "Not final diagnosis, but enough to challenge a blunt transfer call." He took the page like it might tear, then slid it into a clear folder already thick with the day's hard-won paper trail. At 1:34 p.m., as the first visitors filtered into the observation side under ranger supervision, Doug moved to the 5-meter line inside the service corridor and kept his profile open, eyes soft, voice unused. He was not trying to cue Mosey now. He was trying to avoid cueing him, so any behavior could stand as the animal's own choice in a controlled setting. Mosey remained near the interior mound, picking through browse with slower, more regular motions than Morning, occasionally glancing toward the hall when footsteps passed. Each glance registered alertness, not panic. Doug marked each one anyway. Harris checked in from the public lane. Hall 2 occupancy is 3 adults, no crowding. Decibel average 42. A minute later. Accessibility party has arrived at main gate. Heading your way in 2. Doug looked at Nia. She already had the camera angles up and recording indicators red. Imani adjusted her tablet, shoulders squared. Matteo stood at the threshold with a clipboard and the expression of a man trying to hold protocol and empathy in the same hand, without dropping either. The atmosphere tightened, not with chaos, but with concentrated attention. Lena Park entered Observation Hall 2 at 1:58 p.m., beside her mother, Hannah, and therapist Gillian Sato, her wheelchair moving almost silently on anti-rattle hubs that muted every seam in the concrete. She wore a yellow rain shell over a rehab clinic t-shirt, dark hair tied back, cheeks pale from treatment fatigue, but eyes sharply attentive. Doug recognized her from donor photo boards, though in person she looked smaller and steadier than the smiling portrait in the annual report. Gillian crouched beside her and spoke low, guiding a breathing count with 2 fingers raised. Lena nodded, rolled closer to the glass, and rested her hands on her lap. Mosey noticed them within seconds. He rose halfway, shoulders broadening, and crossed the habitat with a speed that made 2 visitors step back and gasp. Harris lifted one hand, signaling stillness on the public side. Doug held his line and kept his palms down, heart hammering hard enough he felt it in his throat. Mosey stopped one body length from the barrier, head high, eyes fixed not on the standing adults but on Lena's seated face at his level. The silverback's chest expanded with one huge breath. Then another. He did not strike. He did not vocalize. He watched. Gillian began Lena's practiced exercise in a whisper Doug could not hear through laminated glass, but could read by rhythm. Inhale 4, hold, exhale 4, fold slightly forward from the waist to release upper back tension, then return upright. Lena followed with calm precision, shoulders rounding gently, chin lowered for one count before lifting again. As she moved into that folded shape a second time, Mosey's posture changed so quickly, Doug felt the room tip into suspense. The silverback's raised shoulders dropped. His jaw softened. He folded forward over his own chest in the same compact hunch, almost a mirror, and lowered his gaze. No one moved. At 2:13 p.m., the hall sat in a silence so complete that even the vents seemed to pause. Mosey stepped closer to the barrier, each knuckle placement careful and controlled, and stopped inches from the glass directly across from Lena's chair. Doug's stomach knotted, waiting for a feint, a slap, any burst of force that would collapse the fragile evidence they had fought for all day. Instead, Mosey slowly opened his right hand and pressed his palm flat to the barrier at Lena's eye level. Fingers spread, wrist relaxed, head still lowered. Lena looked at the hand, then lifted her own palm and placed it on her side of the glass, not touching him, only aligning. Nia breathed. Marking event. But her voice broke on the second word. Matteo whispered, "No impact, no threat vocalization, open hand contact." Imani did not look away from her tablet. Respiratory dropping, 19, 18. Lena stayed with the breathing cycle, her shoulders rounding and releasing, while Mosey held the protective hunch and matched her pace, inhale and exhale visible in the broad expansion of his ribcage. Doug felt awe and dread colliding in his chest, because the behavior was so clear and so easy to misread in a single, frozen frame. On camera, a silverback rushing the barrier could still look like aggression. In live time, the sequence read as communication shaped by pain memory and recognition of vulnerable posture. A tray clanged in a distant prep sink 2 corridors away, metallic and abrupt. Every muscle in Doug's body braced for the old cascade. Mosey flinched, shoulders jumping, hand lifting an inch from the glass. Lena startled too, then immediately returned to her breathing count with Gillian's quiet cue. Mosey looked at her, refolded over his chest, and replaced his open palm against the barrier, this time lower, gentler. No slam came, no charge. The room exhaled as one organism. Harris touched his radio but did not transmit, eyes wet and fixed on the glass. Hannah covered her mouth with both hands, tears gathering without sound. Gillian kept counting with clinical calm, yet her own shoulders trembled. Doug realized his hands were shaking again and pressed them against his thighs to steady them. He needed this captured cleanly, logged precisely, anchored in numbers before emotion overwhelmed format. "Nia," he said quietly. "Tag from first approach to current contact. Include concurrent decibel stream. Pull all camera angles." "Already pulling," she whispered, eyes shining. For 43 seconds, Mosey and Lena remained in that mirrored posture, separated by laminated glass, linked by pace and shape rather than touch. Then Mosey lowered his hand, sat back on his haunches, and kept his gaze soft on Lena, while she finished one final exhale and straightened. He did not retreat in agitation. He did not escalate. He simply stayed near, chest still slightly folded, as if the posture itself had become a shared language for safety. Doug turned to Imani. Her face had gone very still, the way it did when a hypothesis crossed into evidence. She said, almost to herself, This wasn't random volatility. Doug swallowed. No. Imani finally looked at him, voice low and firm. Get me the clip, the vitals overlay, and the timestamp chain in 5 minutes. We're walking this straight to Ellen before anyone reframes it. Doug moved first. He took the spare tablet from Nia's station, thumbed the secure upload icon, and watched the progress wheel spin while the room behind him stayed held in that same stunned quiet, the kind that came after a loud truth rather than a loud noise. Through the laminated glass, Lena still sat at Mosey's eye level, her palm lifted, her breathing steady under Gillian Sato's counting hand. Mosey remained folded in front of her with his shoulders lowered and his gaze soft, massive body compacted around an old injury that had been misread for 11 straight days. "Lockhall 2, Doug said, keeping his voice even. "No new entries. Keep decibel feed running live." Harris answered without taking his eyes off the barrier. "Locked. 40 decibels average. I've got it." Nia's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling 4 synchronized angles at once. Overhead enclosure cam, side corridor cam, public hall wide, and the close panel shot where hand met glass. "I'm tagging from 13:58:04 first orient to 14:14. 02 disengage," she said, voice still thin with adrenaline. "Adding biometric overlay and sound channel." Imani stood near Doug's shoulder, still and focused, the way she looked when emotion and evidence were fighting for first position, and she refused to let either win alone. "Flag the tray clang at 14:13:11, she said. "That rebound matters." "Marked," Nia replied. He flinched, then refolded. "No strike." Doug looked through the glass once more and felt the shock of it again in his ribs. The feared sequence had occurred in full public view. Rapid approach, high mass, barrier proximity. Every external sign that usually triggered panic had been there, but the outcome had inverted. Instead of impact, Mosey had matched a vulnerable posture from a child in a wheelchair and regulated downward in real time. He keyed the corridor speaker on low and addressed the observation side without stepping past protocol lines. "Hannah, Gillian, thank you for staying calm," he said quietly. "Please keep Lena where she is for 30 more seconds while we finish logging." Hannah Park nodded, tears on her face, one hand resting on the wheelchair handle. Gillian gave a professional thumbs up, never breaking Lena's breath count. Lena did not look away from Mosey. She exhaled on 4 and folded slightly forward again, slower this time, practiced and precise. Mosey watched, then copied the shape for a third time. No one in the control corridor spoke. The Silverback's movement was deliberate enough that Doug could track each stage, knees softening, spine curving, forearms crossing near the sternum, right hand settling above the clavicle scar, head lowered, jaw loose. It was self-protection, yes, but it was also social alignment. He was not hiding from Lena. He was matching her rhythm and signaling restraint with open hands between folds. At 2:16 p.m., Nia pushed the final file to the incident server and turned the tablet so Doug could see the stamped chain of custody entries fill in. Source camera IDs, unedited clip hashes, audio integrity confirmation, observer initials, and exact clock sync to sanctuary master time. Hard evidence, clean and difficult to dismiss. "Ready," she said. Imani held out her hand. "Give it to me." Doug passed her the tablet, then grabbed the printed clinical addendum and mitigation packet from the prep counter in one sweep. The paper edges caught his palm, sharp and real. "Mateo, stay on Mosey," he said. "Same line, same quiet window. No behavior cueing unless he escalates." Mateo nodded once. "Go." They moved fast through the service corridor, boots ringing on damp steel where the rain had tracked in, then onto rubberized hallway flooring that swallowed sound. Doug felt every second as pressure now, not dread. They had what the committee had asked for, corroboration that any board member could understand in 30 seconds. The challenge was getting them to watch the full sequence instead of one frame. By 2:21 p.m., they entered Administrative Wing B, where the air smelled like copier toner and wet coats, and Ellen Shaw was already halfway out of her office with her reading glasses in hand. "You have it?" she asked. Imani handed over the tablet. Unedited, 4 angles, synchronized with live decibel and respiratory data. This is the event. Ellen stepped back inside and closed the door behind them. "Show me." The first playback ran in real time on her wall monitor. Lena rolled into frame, Mosey orienting, fast approach. Visitor recoil in the corner. Then the fold, the lowered gaze, the palm at seated eye level. Ellen's mouth parted slightly at that moment. Not dramatic, just involuntary. The clip continued to the tray, clang and rebound, a startle, a lifted shoulder, then immediate re-regulation when Lena resumed breathing. "Again," Ellen said. Imani replayed with overlays active. A blue sound graph rose at the clang, then dropped. Respiratory line peaked, then fell from 24 to 19. No panel impact markers appeared. No threat vocalization tags. No pursuit flags. Ellen stared at the final frame where Mosey sat near the barrier, chest still partially folded, eyes on Lena, hands open. "He mirrored her," she said quietly. Doug answered, "Yes." Could this be novelty response to a wheelchair? Imani shook her head. If novelty drove arousal, we'd expect vigilance increase, piloerection, likely force testing at barrier. We saw the opposite. He downshifted. Ellen looked between them, then tapped the screen where Mosey's right hand settled near his scar. "And pain?" "Still likely contributing," Imani said. "The key is that the posture event tracked as defensive and communicative, not offensive patterning." Ellen reached for her desk phone and pressed the internal conference line. "Get Chair Donnelly and the 2 remote board members back on now," she said. "Emergency reconvene, 10 minutes. Use room Cedar." She hung up and turned to Doug. "You're presenting this clip yourself. Keep it procedural. No interpretation language they can call emotional bias." He felt a brief flash of anger at the phrase, then let it go because time mattered more than pride. Understood. They crossed the corridor into room Cedar at 2:29 p.m., and the table filled quickly. Ellen at head position, Chair Donnelly with legal pad open, Harris from security requested as witness, Mateo patched in from Control 2 on speaker, and the 2 remote board members reappearing on the wall screen, one with a headset still half on from whatever meeting she had left. Donnelly nodded to Doug. "Proceed." Doug stood, palms resting on the chair back to keep steady, and spoke in the same clipped cadence he used for incident reports. At 13:58, accessibility visitor Lena Park entered Hall 2 under quiet window controls. At 14:12, subject Mosey approached barrier at speed and halted without contact. At 14:13, visitor executed guided breathing and forward fold movement. Subject mirrored folded posture, lowered gaze, and placed open palm at visitor eye level. At 14:13:11, metallic clang occurred from prep corridor. Subject startled, then returned to folded posture with no strike and resumed open hand contact. No threat vocalizations, no pursuit behavior, no barrier impact. He gestured to Imani. She ran the clip. No one interrupted during the first pass. On the second pass, the remote member named Carla Nguyen leaned toward her camera and said, "Could this be selective framing? I want raw lead in and lead out." Nia's prepared file was already cued by Imani. The lead-in showed the hall entry and calm baseline. The lead-out showed disengagement and Mosey remaining settled near straw. No omitted aggression. No hidden burst. Carla sat back slowly. All right. Donnelly looked to Harris. Security read. Harris cleared his throat. From public side, this looked intense at approach, but he checked himself before barrier. I saw no intent to breach. Visitors complied. No one at immediate risk. Ellen asked the question the whole day had hinged on. Dr. Reyes, one sentence, does this evidence support immediate Red 12 transfer? Imani did not hesitate. No, it supports immediate trauma-informed modification and continued medical workup in place. The second remote board member, Paul Sethi, frowned at his notes. I still need assurance this is reproducible and not a one-off. Doug answered before Donnelly could move on. Reproducibility under controlled conditions is exactly what we've requested and been denied until now. We can run a supervised non-contact trial with fixed positions, medical oversight, and decibel control. If behavior repeats, classification should change today. The room went still. Donnelly tapped his pen twice, then looked at Ellen. Can operations support that without adding risk? Ellen turned to Doug and Harris together. Can you? Doug nodded. Yes. Marked line for staff at 5 meters. Visitor remains behind laminated glass with guardian and therapist. Quiet route lock. Security on both doors. Immediate stop criteria if any barrier strike above threshold. Harris added, My team can hold perimeter and clear hall. Donnelly exhaled and wrote a single line on his pad. Then we authorize one controlled trial at end of visitor window. Not publicized. Full recording mandatory. The sentence landed through Doug like a physical release, but only partly. Authorization was not outcome. They still had to execute without error. Ellen pushed her chair back. I want formal language drafted now. Red 12 in temporary hold status pending trial completion at 1742. If trial confirms defensive pattern, transfer order is suspended and replaced with care plan revision. If not, we reconvene immediately. She looked at Doug with an expression he had not seen from her all day. Less defensive, more human. You were right to push for nuance. He answered with a small nod because anything larger might crack his voice. Thank you for watching the whole sequence. By 2:46 p.m., the emergency memo had been typed, printed, signed by Ellen and Donnelly, then scanned into the protocol archive with a red temp hold banner across the top. Physical evidence had become policy language in under 30 minutes, the fastest institutional pivot Doug had seen in years. He took the signed paper back down the corridor himself. When he reached Control 2, Nia was still at her station, eyes bright with fatigue, and Mateo stood at the glass line exactly where Doug had left him. Mosi sat near the panel, not pressed to it, chewing slowly through a soft browse bundle. Lena and her family were gone now, escorted out on quiet route, but their presence seemed to linger in the room as rhythm rather than memory. Doug held up the memo. Nia read the header and covered her mouth with both hands. Temporary hold, she whispered. They actually did it. Until 5:42, Doug said. Then controlled trial. Mateo let out a long breath and rubbed the back of his neck. That buys him a chance. Doug stepped to the glass and studied Mosey's posture. Shoulders still lowered, right hand scar touch reduced to brief checks, not constant guarding. Breathing regular, no pacing loop. The silverback glanced up, met Doug's eyes, and performed a short chest fold, then released, hands open. A signal. Clearer now. By the second week of October, Doug would later realize, he had begun measuring hope the same way he measured risk, by repeatable patterns. In that moment, standing with rain-damp cuffs and a signed hold order in his hand, awe did not feel like sentiment. It felt like the shock of seeing an animal's meaning survive the machinery built to flatten it. He keyed the operations channel and gave the next sequence in calm, exact terms. All units, this is Robinson. Red 12 is in temporary hold, pending supervised trial at 1742 under veterinary oversight. Maintain quiet window controls, route locks, and decibel monitoring. Archive every contact point. We do this clean. Acknowledgements clicked back one by one. Then he lowered his radio, kept his body turned slightly sideways to the panel, and mirrored Mosey's slow exhale once, just once, while the sanctuary around them shifted from fear into careful attention. At 3:02 p.m., Doug was still standing at the panel line when his radio clicked with Ellen Shaw's voice, steadier than it had been all morning. Operations, confirm receipt of temporary hold conditions and trial checklist. He keyed back. Control 2 confirms. Checklist in progress. Good, Ellen said. A beat passed, then she added, quieter. I've notified legal that all raw files and physical packet copies are preserved pending final decision. That sentence mattered as much as any clinical note. No one could trim this day down to a single frightening frame now. The next 2 hours moved in disciplined, exhausting detail. Nia printed duplicate chains of custody for every clip, then walked them by hand to records where archive clerk Priya Nandan signed each transfer log with timestamp and seal number, while Doug watched through the counterglass. Glenn's maintenance work orders were scanned, countersigned, and attached to the mitigation file. Harris filed his public side witness statement, including the line that Mosey halted under his own control before the barrier. Mateo submitted his corridor report and finally admitted what he had stopped short of saying in the morning. I thought we were going to lose him to protocol, not because he got worse, because we got scared. He said it looking at the floor, and Doug gripped his shoulder once, in silent thanks. By 4:11 p.m., Dr. Imani Reyes had completed a second standoff thermal pass and compared it to the morning scan. Heat map still elevated near the scar tract during startle rehearsal, she said, sliding the tablet toward Doug. But baseline is lower under quiet controls. That supports pain flare, not generalized aggression. At 4:37, Hannah Park called from the visitor lot before leaving, asking whether Lena's participation had caused trouble. Doug took the call in the side office with rainwater drying on his cuffs. It helped, he said. You both followed instructions perfectly. Hannah cried quietly, then thanked him for treating her daughter like a partner instead of a risk. Gillian Sato emailed her therapy note 15 minutes later, documenting Lena's breathing cadence and posture timing at the glass. Nia printed it, clipped it to the trial packet, and wrote the receipt number in block letters so nobody could claim it appeared later. At 5:24 p.m., the sanctuary shifted into that tense, thin quiet that comes before a storm line or an operating room incision. Hall 2 was cleared and locked. 5 staff took assigned positions. Lena, Hannah, and Gillian returned to their taped marks behind laminated glass. Doug stepped to the painted 5-meter line in the service corridor, palms low, feet angled, body turned slightly left the way Mosey tolerated best. The decibel monitor held at 39. Ellen stood behind the secondary barrier with Chair Donnelly and a legal observer. No one spoke above a whisper. At 5:42 p.m. exactly, Imani raised 2 fingers. Trial begins. Lena inhaled on 4, held, exhaled, then folded forward gently. Doug gave the only cue he was authorized to give. Barely more than breath. Easy, Mosey, easy. Mosey moved fast enough to make 3 adults flinch anyway. He crossed the habitat in a dark, heavy blur, stopped inches from the barrier, and looked first at Doug, then at Lena. His chest was high, shoulders broad, every visual signal that had terrified people for days. Doug felt his heartbeat hammer in his ears and kept his own jaw loose so he would not transmit tension down the line. Lena exhaled again and folded. Mosey's posture changed in stages, visible and deliberate. Shoulders dropping, chin lowering, forearms crossing over his chest without impact, right hand settling near the pale clavicle scar, fingers opening. He pressed his palm to the glass at Lena's eye level and held there. No strike, no bark, no lunge. Imani spoke without looking away from her monitor. Respiratory 23 to 19, muscle tone down, no pilorection. A metal cartwheel squeaked in a distant corridor. Mosey flicked his head, startled, then returned his gaze to Lena and refolded with open hands. Gillian whispered the count, and Lena matched it perfectly, calm as metronome work in a clinic room. Through the glass, the largest body in the sanctuary matched her pace. The trial clock ran 2 minutes. Mosey disengaged by sitting back, not retreating, still oriented to Lena with soft eyes and lowered jaw. Imani ended the sequence. Trial complete. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Ellen turned to Donnelly and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of Hall 2, "Record this as a confirmed defensive pain memory pattern with social co-regulation response. Transfer order is suspended effective now." Doug shut his eyes once, hard. When he opened them, Nia was crying silently with her fists pressed to her mouth. Harris wiped his face with the back of his sleeve and pretended he had just scratched an itch. Mateo leaned both palms against the wall and bowed his head, like someone set down a weight he had carried too long. Imani did not let emotion outrun procedure. "We still need post-trial imaging while arousal markers are fresh. Doug, maintain line. No additional cues." At 6:06 p.m., under quiet controls, she captured a cleaner ultrasound window as Mosey paused near panel C4. The image showed soft tissue thickening and fluid near the old scar consistent with recurrent inflammatory flare. She froze the frame, tagged it, and said the sentence the day had been waiting for. This wasn't aggression patterning. This was defensive pain memory. Ellen heard it, signed the final Red 12 reversal form at 6:19 p.m. and handed the paper to Doug herself. Protocol replaced with trauma-informed care plan, effective immediately. Acoustic dampening installation authorized within 48 hours. Adaptive visitor windows approved. Training revision mandatory for all keepers and security. Doug took the form with both hands. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ellen said, eyes wet but steady. "Keep teaching us to read what we're seeing." By 7:03 p.m., rain had stopped. The sanctuary smelled of wet cedar and warm concrete as evening shift settled in. Doug sat at the records table with Priya, Imani, and Nia, closing every open thread one by one. Incident tablet exported and archived. Thermal files checksum verified. Ultrasound stills entered into Mosey's medical chart. Decibel logs attached to maintenance corrective action. Hannah's call outcome documented. Gillian's therapy note filed. Security statement signed. Emergency memo marked superseded by final directive. Nothing left loose. Nothing left to rumor. 6 weeks later, at 7:05 a.m. on a clear November morning, Doug stood in the same corridor and watched Mosey finish his full leaf mix, then accept citrus without hesitation. The scale read plus 3.1 kilograms from transfer review day. Nia, now less shaky and more sure, read from her tablet with a smile she did not hide. Posture events down 82%. No high force impact since dampening install. Startle recoveries under 40 seconds on average. Imani joined them in a wool cap and gloves, breath fogging in the cold. "Scar region still sensitive in storms," she said, "but flare cycle is controlled. Analgesic protocol and route changes are working." At 9:12, Lena arrived for the first scheduled monthly enrichment window under the new program, wheels nearly silent on the resurfaced hall flooring. She and Gillian took their marks. Hannah watched from the bench with a thermos and red eyes that looked relieved now, instead of frightened. Lena began her breathing sequence, and Mosey approached at a walk, folded once, and placed his palm to the glass, with careful, open fingers. Doug stayed at 5 meters, exactly where protocol now told him to stand, and mirrored one slow exhale. Behind him, Ellen and Chair Donnelly observed a staff training session where Doug and Imani taught the revised interpretation model with clips from that day in October. Not hero footage, teaching footage, trigger mapping, posture decoding, pain indicators, stop criteria, de-escalation choices. Harris asked 2 practical questions and took notes. Mateo answered a junior keeper's worried look with a small nod that said he remembered what fear felt like and what evidence could do. When the session ended, Ellen signed the final adoption line for the new behavioral protocol and passed copies down the table. "This is now standard at North Ridge," she said. "We do not label first and listen later." Doug returned to Hall 2 before lunch. Mosey was seated near the panel, sunlight across his shoulders, hand resting lightly near the old scar but not gripping it. Lena completed her last 4-count exhale, smiled through the glass, and rolled back with Gillian and Hannah. Mosey watched them go, then turned to Doug and gave a brief, folded posture, opened his hands, and settled. Staff, who had once stepped back from him now, stood in quiet, some with tears they did not hide, because the animal they had called unpredictable had been legible all along. He had not asked for force. He had asked for safety in the only language his body trusted. And once they learned to answer that language, the whole sanctuary changed how it listened.